It says, Jesus was walking along. He saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This has happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. Probably a pretty good passage to highlight there. We must quickly carry out the task assigned to us by the one who has sent us, or sent me, as some translations say. The night is coming and then no one can work, but while I'm here in the world, I am the light of the world. Now here's the deal. It was a commonly held view in that culture that if you were dealing with some major medical condition or ailment, that God was punishing you for something you had done or your parents had done. Jesus is kind of debunking that myth here and kind of explaining that there is more to pain and more to some of the things that go wrong in this world, suffering, than kind of the narrow, closed-minded view that so many of them held in their culture. Now, I'm not going to walk that out real far. I'm really excited. Richard's preaching next week, and he's going to be expanding on that thought a lot out of John chapter 11, but it's important to go ahead and note here. Verse 6. Then he spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Siloam meant sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. Now here's the funny thing with this miracle. Jesus has already proven to us that he can heal somebody just by saying it or just by talking. In fact, we saw that several weeks ago when we looked at the official son who's healed from a distance by Jesus' words. It does conjure up for us an image, a reminder of what God does in the very beginning of Genesis. He forms Adam out of the dust of the earth, and here Jesus does the same thing to give this man sight. As preacher Aaron Brockett says, I wonder if Jesus thought to himself while he was performing this miracle, I am the potter, and you are the clay. And as incredible as this moment must have been, as he headed to this pool and for the first time the mud washed out of his eyes, he sees light, much like we just saw with those two girls. It's actually what happens post-miracle where we see the most fireworks happen in the narrative. Let's continue on. Verse 8. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Some said he was, others said, no, he just looks like him. He's his doppelganger. But the beggar kept saying, yes, I am the same one. They asked, who healed you? What happened? He told them, the man, they said, Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes. It spread it over my eyes and told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So they went and washed. So I went and washed, and now I can see. Where is he now? They asked. I don't know, he replied. Then they looked at the man who had been blind to the Pharisees. Then they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees because it was on the Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud and healed him. Of course it is. Jesus always seems to perform miracles on the Sabbath to kind of create some fireworks between him and the Pharisees. The Pharisees asked the man all about it. So he told them, he put the mud over my eyes, and when I washed it away, I could see. Now here's the deal. This man's not one to elaborate much, okay? Like a typical guy. He just gives us the straight up facts here, repeats the same answer a couple of times. He's not gonna give us much more than that. And I want you to note here that at this point, this guy is still pretty neutral in the game. He's not really siding towards Jesus. He's not really siding towards the Pharisees. He's just stating the facts of what has happened to him thanks to Jesus. Very neutral. We're gonna see this continue to happen though. Some of the Pharisees said, this is the man, this man Jesus is not from God, for he is working on the Sabbath. Others said, but how could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs? So there was deep division among them. Then the Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, what's your opinion about this man who healed you? The man replied, I think he must be a prophet. So in keeping with much of what we see in John, where so many times we watch this process of people starting to figure out Jesus and come to him, he's already gone from being neutral to now saying that he's a prophet. He's getting warmer, okay? He's getting closer to who Jesus actually is. The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see, so they called in his parents. They asked, is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he now see? His parents replied, we know this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anyone saying that Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, he is old enough, ask him. In other words, they're saying, we're retired, okay? We just want to relax, get off our backs. He is old enough as a guy now to kind of do his own thing. Ask him what has happened. We don't want any part of this situation. And so they continue to ask, they continue to answer him. For the second time, they called in the man who had been blind and told him. Find it interesting. They are so stubborn about what they view truth to be that they're not even recognizing. They have to keep asking, they have to keep questioning when it is right in front of them. For the second time, they asked him. They called in the man who had been born blind and told him, God should get the glory for this, because we know this man Jesus is a sinner. I don't know whether he's a sinner, the man replied, but I know this, just as we just sang a minute ago. I was blind, and now I can see. But what did he do, they asked. How did he heal you? Look, the man exclaimed, I told you once. Didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? I love this guy. Then they cursed him and said, you are his disciple, but we are the disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from. Well, that's very strange, he replied. A lot of sarcasm here, very strong. The man replied, he healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he's ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. Love it. I mean, he's now actually preaching to the Pharisees. Pretty amazing. You were born a total sinner, they answered. Are you trying to teach us? And they threw him out of the synagogue. When Jesus heard that this had happened, he found the man. I love this about the heart of Christ. He hears that this man has been thrown out, that he's being persecuted, and he seeks him out. It's the heart of our Savior. And he asks, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. You have seen him, Jesus said, and he is speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. Then Jesus told him, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think that they can see that they are blind. Some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard him and asked, are you saying we're blind? If you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty, Jesus replied, but you remain guilty because you claim that you can see. Now here's the deal. Like every encounter that we have covered, that we have kind of looked at in this series, I could easily preach 4 or 5 sermons on this text. Fortunately, this morning, I only have time to preach one, which I'm sure makes you all very, very sad. And for me, what it comes down to is the major theme that John is trying to get us to see, the reason he included this in his gospel. It comes down to a theme that runs throughout the course of his gospel, and it's this: spiritual blindness. In fact, one of the incredible things in this text, in this passage, is that we end up landing in a place we never dreamed we would have 41 verses earlier. It's not the physical healing of this guy's sight that is so miraculous, that is the most epic healing that happens here. It's his spiritual sight. In fact, the irony of the story is that the guy that was born blind is told that he can see at the end of the story, and the people who think that they can see, the Pharisees, are rendered blind by the end of the text. What's the difference between the two? This man born blind and the Pharisees? Well, it's really simple. It's Jesus. The only reason one can see and one can't, it's Jesus. In fact, John is wanting us to simply get this point, that spiritually speaking, and I probably shouldn't just say spiritually speaking, in general, we cannot see truth or life for what it is without Jesus. Without Jesus, we cannot see truth or life for what it is. In fact, the Pharisees really teach us this. You know, they had made up their mind. They had built a whole lifestyle and methodology based on what they had perceived truth to be. For them, it was very much a works-based theology, that they could save themselves, find meaning and purpose just in their own good works. And in the same way, 2,000 years later, so many of us do the exact same thing. Not maybe in the same way that the Pharisees did, but in our own way, we create our own truth and build our lifestyle around it. And what Jesus was telling them and what he's telling us is that without him, we do not have truth. We are like a blind guy stumbling in the darkness who doesn't know where to go. In fact, I want you to notice in verse number 5, Jesus utters a phrase that foreshadows the whole story. He says, I am the light of the world. I'm the light of the world. Now, if you've been around in this series, if you've been tracking with us, reading with us in John, you know this isn't a new phrase to you. This is something that John continually keeps throwing at us to show us of our spiritual blindness. In fact, if you remember back to our Christmas series, when we looked at the first few chapters of John, we saw John actually utter this. In John chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, right at the very beginning, in him was life, in him being Jesus. And that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Last week, we skipped over it, but right after the story that Daryl preached on, Jesus utters these words in John chapter 8. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness. They'll never be spiritually blind, but will have the light of light. We looked at this already. John declares the reason he writes his gospel is that so that people will see Jesus, believe in Jesus, and see him as truth. And he's been telling us, he's been building this case all along to his readers, to his audience, that without Jesus, we do not know truth, that we do not have life, that we really can't see. But it's now, after 8 chapters of doing this, in chapter 9, where we kind of get the best illustration, the best example of it, where he shows us this link between spiritual blindness and only being able to see because of Jesus. And I want you to think, maybe back to a time as a kid, when your parents tucked you in at night and they turned off the lights and they left the room. And you looked around in the darkness as a kid and you convinced yourself that something that you could see partially, kind of make out in your closet, was a monster. Or that something in your room was a person, and you screamed out, and your parents came running in and they flipped on the lights, and you realized at that moment that what you had convinced yourself of in the darkness wasn't actually true, wasn't actually real. In the same way, maybe you can think of a time as an adult where you went kind of fumbling through the house to get a drink of water in the kitchen, and you didn't turn on any lights because you don't want to wake anybody up, and you thought you knew where to go. You thought you knew the path, but you end up running into some piece of furniture or stubbing your toe on something. And in that moment, you turn on the lamp and you begin to see your error. That's exactly what John's trying to get us to picture. Exactly what Jesus is telling us here. That spiritually speaking, so many of us are walking in darkness. That we're living our lives like completely spiritually blind without being able to see. And much like the Pharisees, we've convinced ourselves, the little bit that we can make out in this life, we've convinced ourselves of certain truths, and we begin to align our whole lives. We begin to operate and move in every possible way as if that's truth. Begin to chase as if that's what's going to give us purpose and meaning. Maybe for some of us, it's the fact that money will give us happiness. Or for some of us, that it's, by having influence or being successful, that we will kind of be able to fill that need for purpose in our lives, or that power will make us someone. Or maybe for some of us, it's relationships. If I just have this epic love story, or if I have this awesome marriage, or if I have this incredible family, that will fill the void that I have deep inside. That's gonna give me my purpose. That's gonna give me my meaning. Or for some of us, it's just simply that religion or morality is what's going to end up making us a good person, or making us feel better about ourselves. And what happens is we become so convinced that that is truth. Again, we begin aligning our lives. We begin chasing after that, doing whatever we can to pursue it. And so many times we become so ingrained in chasing after those things, convincing ourselves that that is truth, that we're very stubborn about it, actually, because we've committed so much of our time, our talent, and our treasure to pursuing it and worshiping it. Just like the Pharisees were. But I have to ask, how many celebrities, people that we think have it all together, do we have to watch in crisis? How many amazing marriages do we have to witness fall apart? How many pro athletes do we have to watch trying to fill their void in any way? How many CEOs and politicians do we have to watch in the midst of scandal before we realize that we are in the midst of darkness? That we're not pursuing truth, that we have no clue where we are going. We are blind to what is actually truth in this life. You see, it's then and only then when we get to that point, when we finally can move beyond our stubbornness, when we finally can move beyond our pride, that we begin to pursue truth. It's when we begin to realize that we don't know what's best, that when we begin to realize that we can't do it on our own. When we begin to realize that all these things that we've been chasing are faulty truths, they're leading us down dead ends. They're leaving us feeling empty at the end of the day. They're never giving us as much as they promised that they would. It's when we begin to realize the implications of how much devastation has happened to ourselves and to those that we love because we've pursued these things that we call sin. It's then when we begin to realize this and we come to Jesus, we come to the light of the world, that we begin to see. We begin to see and be able to operate and realize our error. We're able to realize what we've missed. Like a kid yelling for his parents in the darkness because he's scared. Like someone who finally turns on a lamp in the darkness because they can't see where they're going. We finally see truth. We finally see life for what it really is in Jesus. And this is the foundation of the gospel message, church. And this is what Jesus is talking about at the end of the passage. He says, I have come to give sight to the blind. He says in John chapter 8, if you follow me, you will find truth and the truth will set you free. Anybody who comes to me and says that they're blind and wants to find truth and wants to see, they will see. Their eyes will be open just like Sonia and Anita's were. And they will no longer see darkness, they'll begin to see light. But, and this is a big but, I've also come to render judgment on anyone who thinks that they can see, who stubbornly holds on what they perceive to be truth. I'm gonna make them understand that they can't actually see. And this is an incredibly profound thing Jesus teaches us. And if you get nothing else out of my sermon, hear this. Jesus is telling us that it's not necessarily, the lost people are not necessarily the bad people, they're the proud people. The lost people aren't necessarily the bad people, they're the proud people. Because without Jesus, until we get to that place of understanding that without Jesus, we cannot see truth. We cannot see life for what it is. Let's pray. God, thank you so much that you loved us so much in the midst of our mess, in the midst of our messiness, that you sent Jesus to the cross for us. And the implications of what happened on that hill 2,000 years ago don't just impact our future someday, they impact our life now. That you want to give us life and give it to the full. And I pray that we would begin to understand that as long as we pursue any other truths, we will not ever reach that and what you have for us. God, I pray that there is an awakening out of this place this morning and that we would have thousands of people who are resetting their compass to chase after you and to hail you as King, the ultimate truth. I pray this in your name. Amen.